Hello guys.
Because of our parents' will, relations with my brother were severely shaken and I did not expect him to resort to fraud. Hello everybody, I've been lurking for a while, but I never thought I'd be posting my own story. It feels surreal typing this, but I really need some outside perspective. My name's Ethan, I'm 21, and my little brother Josh is 18. Life was great until a few months ago when tragedy struck. Our parents passed away in an accident. It's been the hardest time of our lives, but what happened next? I still can't believe it. After the funeral, Josh and I had to deal with the estate. We were summoned to the lawyer's office, and honestly, I thought it would be straightforward. I mean, I'm the oldest, I've been helping out more around the house, and I thought my parents would divide everything fairly between us. How wrong I was. The lawyer opened the will, and my heart sank as he read the words. My parents had left everything to Josh. Not just the house, but also their savings, the car, everything. It felt like a slap in the face, but at the same time, it didn't surprise me. My parents always saw me as the troublemaker. I was the rebellious one growing up, the kid who dyed his hair blue in high school and got a tattoo at 18. Josh. He was their golden boy. I tried to stay calm as the lawyer droned on about family values and how they wanted to secure a stable future for Josh. Meanwhile, I was sitting there, fighting back tears, wondering why my own parents couldn't see the effort I had put in to turn my life around. The worst part? After the will was read, Josh turned to me with this smug look and said, "Well, I guess that's settled then." No sympathy. No attempt to say, "Hey, maybe we should split it." Just straight up indifference. It wasn't long before he kicked me out of our house. I packed my bags, trying to keep it together, and went to my grandparents' place. Thankfully, they welcomed me with open arms, but I couldn't help feeling like a stray cat they were pitying. I thought I'd hit rock bottom. Little did I know, things were about to get a whole lot worse. Settling in at my grandparents' place was like putting a band-aid on a bullet wound. Sure, it gave me a roof over my head and some emotional support, but deep down, I was still seething over the unfairness of it all. Josh got everything handed to him on a silver platter while I was left to fend for myself. I tried to focus on moving forward, but then Josh pulled a stunt so low it felt like the universe was mocking me. One day, I got a letter in the mail, a legal letter. My stomach dropped as I read through it. Apparently, Josh had somehow transferred the mortgage for our parents' house into my name. Yep, you read that right. My little brother, the golden child, decided he didn't want to deal with the financial burden of the house he inherited. So, he found a shady way to stick me with the responsibility. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake. I mean, who even does that? But when I confronted Josh, he didn't even bother denying it. "It's your fault for not pulling your weight when Mom and Dad were alive," he sneered. "Think of it as paying them back." I was furious. "You kicked me out, Josh. And now you expect me to pay for a house I'm not even allowed to live in. Life's not fair," he shot back with a smirk before slamming the door in my face. I was so angry I could have screamed. Instead, I went straight to my grandparents, who were equally appalled. Thankfully, my grandpa was sharp as a tack when it came to legal stuff. With his help, we dug into the paperwork, and, surprise, surprise, it turned out Josh had bribed a small-town judge to make it happen. My grandparents insisted we fight it, and after weeks of stress, we managed to get the whole thing overturned. When I told Josh the mortgage was officially back in his name, he lost it. "You're just bitter because Mom and Dad like me more," he yelled, his face turning beet red. I didn't even argue. I just walked away, letting him stew in his own mess. The mortgage, the house, it was all his problem now. Little did he realize, that problem was about to grow bigger than he could handle. After the mortgage fiasco, Josh's life started unraveling fast. Turns out, inheriting everything isn't all sunshine and rainbows when you have zero financial responsibility. He'd been living in the house like it was a frat party headquarters, blowing through our parents' savings on junk like video games, takeout, and who knows what else. By the time the mortgage came back to him, he was completely broke. To make matters worse, Josh wasn't working. He'd been coasting off the inheritance, assuming it would last forever. Now, with bills piling up, he had no choice but to find a job. But here's the thing about Josh, he'd never held a job in his life. His idea of work was mowing the lawn once a month and calling it a day. The real world, it hit him like a freight train. He ended up taking a minimum wage job at a local fast food joint, and let me tell you, the irony was almost too much to handle. This was the same kid who used to brag about how he'd never work a loser job. Now, he was flipping burgers and working double shifts just to keep the lights on. I'd like to say I felt sorry for him, but honestly, I didn't. Not after the way he treated me. My grandparents, however, were more forgiving. They even offered to help Josh manage his finances, but he was too proud to accept. "I don't need charity," he spat when Grandpa suggested budgeting. "I'll figure it out myself." Spoiler alert, he didn't figure it out. Within months, he was falling behind on payments and racking up debt. His car got repossessed, and he started getting those ominous foreclosure notices. Watching him spiral was like watching a slow-motion car crash, painful, but impossible to look away from. Then came the breaking point. One day, Josh showed up at my grandparents' house unannounced. He looked terrible, disheveled, exhausted, and clearly at the end of his rope. "Ethan," he said, avoiding my eyes, "I need your help." It was the first time I'd seen him swallow his pride, and honestly, I didn't know how to feel. But whatever pity I might have had for him, it evaporated the moment he uttered his next sentence. "They're going to foreclose on the house unless you lend me the money." When Josh showed up at my grandparents' house unannounced, his appearance said everything before he even opened his mouth. He looked worn down, dark circles under his eyes, clothes wrinkled and baggy, and a desperation that was palpable. It wasn't hard to guess what brought him here. The foreclosure notices had been piling up, and with no savings left, he had run out of options. He sat down stiffly in the living room, avoiding my gaze as he began explaining the situation. The house was about to be taken, and he needed help to cover the overdue mortgage payment. His tone was low, almost apologetic, as he mentioned how hard he had tried to keep up with the bills by working long hours at his fast food job. But it wasn't enough. He needed a loan to make the payment and buy himself some time. As he spoke, all I could think about was the sheer nerve it took for him to come to me for help after everything he'd done. He had kicked me out of the house I grew up in, tried to dump the mortgage on me, and never once offered an apology. Now he wanted me to save the very house he'd thrown me out of. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so infuriating. Josh's excuses and promises felt hollow. He mentioned paying me back once he got on his feet, but I'd heard enough empty words from him to know better. He'd spent years coasting through life on our parents' generosity, and now he expected me to do the same. My grandparents watched the interaction silently at first, but it was clear they weren't impressed either. Grandpa, who had been patient through the whole explanation, finally intervened. He calmly reminded Josh that he was the one who inherited everything, and with that inheritance came responsibilities. Shifting his financial problems onto me wasn't just unfair, it was completely unacceptable. Grandpa's voice carried the kind of authority that only comes with years of experience, and for once, Josh didn't argue. He just sat there, shoulders slumped, staring at the floor. I felt a twinge of pity then. He looked nothing like the smug, untouchable kid who had shoved me out of my own life. But that pity wasn't enough to outweigh the years of hurt and resentment. I told him I couldn't help. It wasn't just about the money, it was about boundaries. Every time I had tried to do the right thing, Josh had taken advantage. I wasn't going to let him drag me down with him. He didn't say much as he left. He just stood up, mumbled something about figuring it out on his own, and walked out the door. The slam echoed through the house, but it wasn't anger, it was defeat. Watching him leave, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was relief that I'd stood my ground, but also guilt. No matter how much he hurt me, he was still my brother, and I couldn't help but wonder if turning him away was the right thing to do. A few weeks later, the inevitable happened. The house went into foreclosure. Josh moved into a dingy apartment on the other side of town, scraping by with long hours and low pay at the fast food joint. The fall from grace had been swift, and I thought he'd finally hit rock bottom. But life wasn't done humbling him yet. After the foreclosure, Josh's life turned into a slow-motion disaster. He had traded our family home for a cramped, run-down apartment in a kind of neighborhood where broken streetlights and graffiti were the norm. Every time I thought he couldn't fall any lower, something else would happen to prove me wrong. Without a car, Josh had to rely on public transportation to get to work. He was always late, which didn't exactly endear him to his boss. I heard through the grapevine, mostly from a former mutual friend, that he had been ridden up multiple times and was hanging by a thread. His fast food job, which he had once mocked as beneath him, had now become the lifeline he clung to. Despite all this, Josh still couldn't seem to accept that his lifestyle had to change. He kept blowing what little money he had left on frivolous things, new sneakers, takeout, video games. He even got a ticket for driving with an expired license after borrowing a friend's car, which made no sense since he couldn't afford to pay the fine. It was like watching someone dig a hole deeper and deeper, oblivious to the fact they were already buried up to their neck. The breaking point came one night when I got a call from our grandparents. Apparently, Josh had shown up at their house again, but this time he wasn't asking for money. He was in tears, rambling about how he couldn't do it anymore. Grandpa, always calm in a crisis, managed to get him to sit down and talk. That's when Josh finally admitted what I'd suspected for a while: he was completely out of control. His mental health was in shambles. I wasn't there for the conversation, but Grandma filled me in later. She said he was dealing with anxiety and depression, worsened by the stress of losing the house and struggling to make ends meet. He talked about how lonely he felt, how he'd pushed everyone away, and how he didn't know how to fix it. Hearing all this secondhand, I didn't know what to feel. On one hand, I was angry that it had taken him hitting rock bottom to even acknowledge his mistakes. On the other, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was ready to change. Grandpa insisted Josh see a doctor, and to my surprise, he actually agreed. They took him to a local clinic, where he was eventually diagnosed with a mood disorder. The doctor recommended therapy and a short stay at a mental health facility to help him stabilize. For the first time in what felt like forever, Josh seemed willing to accept help instead of demanding it. As he packed his things to leave for the facility, he looked like a different person. Not physically, he still had that haggard, stressed out appearance, but emotionally. There was a quiet humility in him that I'd never seen before. It was like he had finally come to terms with the fact that he couldn't keep living the way he had been. I didn't visit him while he was in the facility. Part of me wanted to, but I wasn't sure if I was ready. After all, the wounds he'd left on me hadn't fully healed. Still, I couldn't help but wonder what kind of person he'd be when he came out. Would he be the same selfish, entitled kid who had made my life hell? Or would this finally be the turning point? Josh stayed in the mental health facility for a few months, and during that time, the silence between us felt both strange and necessary. For years, our relationship had been nothing but conflict and resentment, so the distance gave me room to breathe. Still, I couldn't help but wonder how he was doing. My grandparents, who visited him regularly, gave me updates. They said he was taking therapy seriously and even participating in group sessions, something I never imagined Josh would do willingly. When Josh was discharged, he came straight to our grandparents' house. They'd offered to let him stay there temporarily while he got back on his feet. I wasn't there when he arrived, but Grandma called me later to say how different he seemed. "It's like he finally woke up," she said. I didn't know what to make of that, but her words stuck with me. A few days later, Josh called me. Hearing his voice after all that time felt surreal. He didn't jump straight into excuses or small talk. Instead, he apologized. For everything. He admitted to being selfish, immature, and reckless, and he owned up to the pain he'd caused me. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, "but I'm trying to be better. I just wanted you to know that." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind him of every time he'd hurt me. But another part of me, the part that remembered him as the little brother who used to follow me around, looking up to me, wanted to believe him. I told him it would take time, but I appreciated the effort. Over the next few weeks, we started talking more. At first, it was awkward and tentative, like we were strangers trying to get to know each other again. But gradually, those conversations began to feel less forced. He told me about his therapy sessions, how they'd helped him understand why he acted the way he did. He admitted that losing everything, our parents, the house, even his pride, had forced him to confront the parts of himself he'd been avoiding for years. Josh also started taking small steps to rebuild his life. He got a part-time job at a local bookstore, a far cry from his old fast food gig but something he actually seemed to enjoy. He even signed up for a budgeting class at the community center, determined to learn how to manage his finances responsibly. It wasn't much, but it was progress. One day, he asked if we could meet in person. I hesitated at first, but eventually, I agreed. We met at a park near my apartment, and as we sat on a bench overlooking the lake, he apologized again. This time, it felt less like an obligation and more like a genuine expression of remorse. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I want to earn it." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in years, I saw the brother I used to know. The one who laughed too loudly at his own jokes and always wanted to team up with me in video games. The one I thought I'd lost forever. "You've got a long way to go," I told him. "But I'm willing to try." After that day at the park, Josh and I made an unspoken agreement to start fresh. It wasn't easy. Trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight, especially when it's been broken as badly as ours. But for the first time in years, I felt like we were on the same page. Josh wasn't just apologizing anymore, he was actively trying to change. He continued living with our grandparents while working at the bookstore. It wasn't glamorous, but he seemed content. He started saving money, even setting up a small emergency fund, a huge step for someone who used to blow through cash like it was monopoly money. He also stuck with therapy, which was helping him understand the deeper issues behind his behavior. One of the most surprising changes was how he treated our grandparents. Before, he had taken their kindness for granted, often brushing off their advice or rolling his eyes at their concern. But now, he made a point to help out around the house, cleaning, running errands, even sitting down to watch Grandma's favorite shows with her. It was small stuff, but it spoke volumes. Our conversations became more frequent and more genuine. He started asking me about my life, something he'd never really done before. How was work? Was I still studying for that certification? What games was I playing lately? It was jarring at first, seeing him take an interest in me instead of just talking about himself, but it felt good. One weekend, he asked if he could visit my apartment. I agreed, though I wasn't sure what to expect. When he arrived, he brought a small plant as a housewarming gift. "Thought your place could use some greenery," he said with a sheepish smile. It was such a simple gesture, but it caught me off guard. For once, it felt like he was trying to give instead of take. We spent the afternoon playing an old co-op game we used to love as kids. At first, it was awkward, neither of us had touched the game in years, and we kept messing up the controls. But soon, we were laughing like we used to, yelling at each other to grab the health pack, or cover the left side. It was the first time in a long time that I felt like I had my brother back. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments when old habits crept in, like when he made a thoughtless comment about how easy my life seemed compared to his. It stung, but instead of letting it fester, I called him out on it. To his credit, he didn't get defensive. He just nodded and said, "You're right. That was out of line." Those moments reminded me that rebuilding trust is a process, not a destination. Josh wasn't perfect, and neither was I. But the important thing was that we were both trying. One day, he brought up the idea of visiting our parents' grave together. It was something I'd avoided since the funeral. I couldn't face the emotions tied to that loss, especially with everything that had happened afterward. But Josh said he needed to go, and he wanted me to come with him. "It's time," he said simply. I wasn't sure I agreed, but I told him I'd think about it. Deep down, I knew he was right. If we were going to move forward, we needed to confront the past, even the parts that hurt the most. When the day came to visit our parents' grave, I was nervous. I hadn't been there since the funeral, and the thought of standing in front of their headstone, surrounded by everything I'd been avoiding, was overwhelming. But Josh had asked, and something about the way he did, quiet, humble, made it impossible to say no. We arrived on a crisp, gray morning. The cemetery was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every step, every rustle of leaves. Josh was carrying a small bouquet of flowers, a mix of lilies and daisies, Mom's favorite. I didn't bring anything. It felt strange enough just being there. When we reached their grave, we stood in silence for a while. The headstone was simple, engraved with their names and dates, along with a quote that read, "Forever in our hearts." It hit me then how much time had passed and how much had changed since we'd lost them. Josh broke the silence first. He knelt down, placing the flowers carefully at the base of the headstone. "I messed up," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look at me, his focus was entirely on the grave. "I let you both down. I let Ethan down. I thought I was invincible, like nothing I did could ever be wrong, and I hurt the people I care about the most." Hearing him say that out loud felt surreal. This was the same person who had once told me to deal with it when he threw me out of our parents' house. Now, he sounded like someone who had finally taken a long, hard look at himself, and didn't like what he saw. I stood there, unsure of what to do or say. Part of me wanted to walk away, to avoid the tidal wave of emotions rising in my chest. But another part, the part that had been longing for closure, kept me rooted in place. "I think they'd be proud of you," I said finally, my voice rough with emotion. "Not for the mistakes you made, but for owning up to them. For trying to fix things." Josh looked up at me then, his eyes red and glassy. He didn't say anything, but the gratitude in his expression was enough. For the first time in years, I felt like we were on the same side. We spent the rest of the visit sharing memories, good ones. Mom's obsession with baking way too many cookies during the holidays. Dad's terrible taste in music that he insisted on playing during every road trip. Little moments that felt insignificant at the time but now carried the weight of a lifetime. Before we left, Josh turned to me. "I know I can't make up for everything," he said, his voice steady but soft. "But I want to try. I want us to be brothers again." His words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. It wasn't forgiveness, at least, not entirely. But it was a step forward, and that was enough for now. As we walked back to the car, I felt a strange sense of lightness, like a burden I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally lifted. The past wasn't erased, and the scars were still there, but for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel so heavy. After our visit to the cemetery, something shifted between Josh and me. It wasn't like we suddenly became best friends. Years of hurt and resentment don't disappear overnight, but there was a new understanding between us. For the first time in a long time, it felt like we were building something instead of tearing it apart. Josh continued making progress in his life. His job at the bookstore turned into a full-time position, and he started taking night classes at the local community college. He said he wanted to study business, maybe open a shop of his own one day. Hearing him talk about the future with so much determination was almost unrecognizable, but in the best way. Our grandparents were thrilled with his progress, and honestly, so was I. He wasn't perfect. There were still moments when his old impulsiveness crept in, like when he splurged on a new gaming console instead of saving for a car. But the difference now was that he acknowledged his mistakes instead of making excuses. Slowly but surely, he was becoming someone I could trust again. One afternoon, he asked if I wanted to help him with his schoolwork. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was the same guy who used to make fun of me for being the responsible one, and now he was asking for my advice on a paper about financial management. But I agreed, and we ended up spending the afternoon at my apartment, going over notes and cracking jokes about how neither of us could remember high school algebra. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. We weren't just brothers again, we were becoming friends. That thought stayed with me long after he left that evening, and for the first time, I felt genuinely hopeful about our relationship. As Josh grew, so did my willingness to let go of the past. One day, I decided to visit the old neighborhood, the house we'd grown up in. It was strange seeing it with fresh eyes, stripped of the resentment I'd carried for so long. The new owners had repainted the shutters and put up a swing set in the yard. It didn't feel like my house anymore, and somehow, that was okay. I told Josh about the visit, and instead of getting defensive or sentimental, he smiled. "Maybe it's a good thing it's not ours anymore," he said. "We can start fresh. Build something better." That idea stuck with me. We'd both been so wrapped up in what we'd lost, our parents, the house, the years we spent at odds with each other, that we hadn't realized what we still had. A chance to move forward. A chance to rebuild. Josh wasn't the same person he'd been when all of this started, and honestly, neither was I. We had both changed, him through the hard lessons life had forced on him, and me through learning how to set boundaries and stand up for myself. The road ahead wasn't going to be perfect, but it felt like it was finally leading somewhere worth going. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was walking it alone. A year after everything fell apart, Josh and I found ourselves standing at a new beginning. It wasn't some grand, cinematic moment. There were no dramatic declarations, no tears or hugs under a sunset. It was just the two of us sitting on my apartment balcony, sipping coffee and talking about nothing in particular. But that quiet, unremarkable moment felt like the culmination of everything we'd worked for. Josh had come a long way. He'd completed his first semester of college with decent grades, something I never thought I'd hear myself saying. He'd saved enough to buy a used car, which he proudly showed off to me one weekend. It wasn't flashy or new, but it was his, and that made all the difference. As for me, I'd moved forward too. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. I'd finished my studies and landed a job in my field, one that gave me a sense of stability I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I wasn't looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next disaster to strike. Our relationship had grown into something I never thought it could be. We weren't just brothers out of obligation, we were partners in rebuilding what had been broken. We talked regularly, shared meals, and even started working on small projects together. One weekend, we repainted our grandparents' garage as a surprise for them. It was messy and chaotic, but we laughed the entire time. That project felt like a metaphor for us, messy, chaotic, but ultimately worthwhile. One evening, as we sat on the balcony, Josh turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "if Mom and Dad could see us now, I think they'd be proud. Not just of me, but of you, for never giving up on me, even when I didn't deserve it." His words caught me off guard. For so long, I'd felt like I was carrying the weight of our fractured family on my shoulders, unsure if I'd ever find peace with it. Hearing Josh acknowledge my efforts wasn't just validation, it was healing. "I think they'd be proud of both of us," I replied. "We've come a long way." He nodded, a small smile on his face. There were no grand speeches after that, no dramatic conclusions. Just a shared understanding that we'd made it through the storm together. Our journey wasn't perfect, and it probably never would be. But as I sat there with my brother, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I realized something important. It didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be ours. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.
See you later.